Greetings ladies and gentlefish, and welcome to this World of Tanks review of the Chinese Tier 8 Premium Heavy Tank, the 112. Now, caveat before we get on with any of the rest of this, as of patch 9.15 the 112 is no longer available for purchase, for regular purchase at least, from the tech tree or from the World of Tanks Premium gift shop. So you can't get your hands on this anymore, although it may come back for the occasional event here or there, who knows. So this is mainly for those people who already own this tank, or in case this does become available for, things like Christmas, it might be available for purchase or something like that, or you do get your hands on it any other way or have the option of getting your hands on it. Is it worth it? Should you bother? Is there any point? All of that jazz. I usually give a bit of a historical rundown of these machines before talking too much about them, but honestly I couldn't really find much about this tank that isn't mentioned in the game description, and the game description is basically that it was part of a development for a Chinese heavy tank, a development that subsequently, after this machine, the 112, led to the 113, which is the Chinese Tier 10 heavy tank, and this tank was basically just a part of that development. So let's just get on with the review itself. Not going to talk about the grind for this machine because of course it is a premium tank, so you get the modules that you get. There is no grind to concern yourself with. So what do you get? Well, we'll talk about the gun in just a bit. For now, all I'm going to say is that the gun is not very good. 6 degrees of gun depression on the tank is not horrendous. It's enough to save the gun depression from being a big weakness. But it's nothing to get too excited about. 1500 hit points on the vehicle, that's the same as an IS-3, for example, and again I'm going to talk more about the armour in a bit. The turret is very well armoured. The hull, it depends where you're shooting, 120 from the front, 80 from the side, 60 from the rear, but again I'll talk about that more in a bit. In terms of mobility, I mean, this is a heavy tank at the end of the day. It's never going to accelerate amazingly well, but it does get a pretty good top speed, in fact a very good top speed for a heavy tank of 45 kilometers an hour. And this does allow you to get into a lot of positions faster than you would otherwise do. It doesn't make the tank agile, but it does mean that you can potentially get to positions that would usually be used by a medium tank rather than a heavy tank, for example, if you should so wish. Traverse speed of 27 degrees per second, stated traverse speed I should say, of 27 degrees per second is, well, it's okay if I compare it with some heavy tanks, 27, 29, 34, it's around about par for the course. What about some of the slower heavies that are out there? I don't know why I'm doing that, I could just scroll along. Tiger 2, 29. So, the stated traverse speed is okay. It leaves the tank above most of the super heavy tanks that tend to get a very slow traverse speed, but it's not anything that's particularly exciting. Concealment, I'm not even going to bother with, and spotting, well, you get a 380 meter view range with this thing, which is not bad, but some people look at this and go that it's a real strength of the vehicle. It's not. 380 is worse than the 400 meters you find on the T-32 or the Carnarvon. It's better than the Soviets' view range, and that's about all you can say about it. It's okay, but it's not something that's really a massive strength that dictates how you play this tank. So, not talking about the grind, what about the gun? Well, the gun is the standard Soviet/Chinese 122mm derp cannon. 4.55 rounds per minute rate of fire, which here at tier 8 is actually quite poor. If I compare, can I bring it up? No, it just diverts to the same gun. Let me just quickly bring up the IS-6 for the sake of comparison, just because it's another, it's the Soviet premium tank that uses this a similar 122mm gun. So just for the sake of comparison, there's the D25TA on the 112, there's the D30 on the IS-6, and immediately you can see that difference in rate of fire. 5.13 on the IS compared with 4.55 on the 112. and that reload on the 112 really is quite painful to go through. Standard 175 pen and 390 alpha damage that you typically find on these sorts of guns, so nothing to get too excited about. The Chinese tank, of course, does fire heat ammunition as its premium ammo, so it gets 250 pen with that, but because of the derpy nature of the gun, it's not uncommon for your shots to hit tracks and whatnot instead and not actually do any damage. 530 alpha damage and 61 penetration. That's a pretty good high explosive round if you get the opportunity to use it. The problem is with such a long reload, the opportunity to use that HE round is quite rare. 0.46 dispersion at 100 meters and a 3.4 second aim time. Both of those things are pretty standard for this kind of gun. So you might be asking, okay, the rate of fire is worse than the IS-6, but you mentioned that this is, well, I can't remember if I did mention now, but I'm going to say it now. This is the worst 122mm gun to be found on a Tier 8 Premium. So it's for a few reasons. Firstly, it's that rate of fire, that 4.55 rounds per minute rate of fire is not very good, but also it's for stats that you can't see in the garage. The bloom values on this tank are horrendous. You move the tank, you move the turret, you move anything, and the reticule just blooms out a huge amount. And that can be really, really frustrating. So, this is one of the worst guns to be found on a Tier 8 heavy tank, in my opinion. It really is a nasty gun to use. So, that gun is really going to influence the sort of choices you want to make with regard to your crew skills, your equipment, ammunition and consumables. Let's kick off by talking about your ammunition. So you've got armor piercing, heat ammo and high explosive. I've taken, you do get quite a generous ammunition supply with the 112s, which is one of the advantages it has over the IS-6, for example. I'm using the IS-6 as a comparison as it's a fairly common comparison to make, though in my opinion the two tanks play very, very differently. So I've got 5 HE rounds, 30 rounds of armor piercing. I've never burned through all that. You know, that's a fairly healthy supply of AP, and 10 heat rounds because the gun is so bad. You will sometimes want to use that heat ammunition to try and penetrate your target if it's some of the more heavily armored targets that you'll be coming across. Equipment, well, there's a few different choices you could make. I think you definitely need a vertical stabilizer to increase your accuracy on the move, and that of course increases your accuracy after you have been on the move, and being on the move includes traversing your hull, so I think a vertical stabilizer is a must. To improve your DPM, I also think a gun rammer, large caliber tank gun rammer, is a must. 10% DPM is 10% DPM, and the DPM on this tank is already pretty poor, so I do strongly recommend a gun rammer. Third equipment slot, I know people use a variety of different things on this. Some people would like to use vents. I would have liked to use vents just for the all-round buff to the tank's performance. Some people even put coated optics on this machine because you've got that 380 meter view range and they say it's pretty decent, so why not make the most of it? Personally, I don't think it's worth it, but that's my opinion. Filling the fuel tanks with CO2, that's not a terrible idea to increase your fuel tank's durability. Your fuel tanks on this machine do get damaged a lot, and as a result you do get set on fire a lot. Heavy spore liner, armor protection from ramming and explosions, and protection to your crew, probably not worth it, I wouldn't recommend it. But the equipment slot, the equipment that I did actually go for was the enhanced gun laying drive. Now it's very rare for me to take this on a higher tier tank, because it's generally speaking not very good, but the aiming with this gun is so painful that I thought anything I can do to improve that has got to be a good thing. So I actually have an enhanced gun laying drive as my third piece of equipment. Crew skills, well, yeah, it's a premium tank, so use whatever your Chinese heavy tank crew is. So this is my one tank crew. This is not a crew I have specifically trained for this tank. But having said that, if you were to take a crew specifically for this tank, it's nothing particularly surprising. It's your standard heavy tank skills. I would take 6th Sense. Well, you want eventually to have 6th Sense on your commander, safe storage on your loader, repairs on the other two, and then some combination of repairs and smooth ride, snapshot, things like that. If you retrain your crew for gold, then start off with repairs on everyone and then retrain the loader and the commander once they reach 100% for that Sixth Sense and safe storage. If you retrain your crew for credits, I think it's better off starting with Sixth Sense and safe storage, just because you don't lose that experience when you do the retraining, or just because you will lose that experience when you do the retraining, which will delay how long it takes you to get that all-important Sixth Sense. Now I mentioned that this tank gets set on fire a lot. That's because of the fuel tanks. There are fuel tanks towards the rear of the tank, in the sides, and also right under this lower front plate, which is really frustrating, especially for reasons that we'll get onto when we talk about the armour. Now this means that I have preventative maintenance here on my driver. It's from my 110. This is not for the 112. Preventative maintenance reduces the chance of engine fire. Doesn't work with fuel tanks, and it's the fuel tanks that are the main reason you set on fire in the 112, so I wouldn't bother with that. Now, I've saved till last to talk about the consumables, and I've saved that till last for a very good reason. Consumables. I would use standard sets of consumables. First aid kit, repair kit, fire extinguisher. Seems dandy. I would not recommend swapping out the fire extinguisher for an automatic fire extinguisher. Why is that? Well, the automatic fire extinguisher, it's an automatic use for putting out a fire, okay, also gives you plus 10% to fire protection. So basically it changes the chance of you being set on fire. Fine, at least to the best of my understanding. That's its passive effect, just for it being equipped on the vehicle. So you might think, well, the 112 gets set on fire. Let's use that. That seems sensible. However, and this was pointed out to me actually by Isla and Baldrick on the EU forums. However, there are two ways a tank can get set on fire. The first is by shots hitting the engine. Every time a shell hits the engine, there is a percentage chance that the tank will set on fire, and you can reduce that percentage chance by using preventative maintenance, the skill on your driver, and or by using the automatic fire extinguisher. That's fine. The other way your tank can get set on fire is by shots to the fuel tanks, but this works a little differently. This works by your fuel tanks as a module have health, have hit points. Every time they get hit, they lose hit points. Once they have been hit, they are damaged, and once you reduce those hit points to 0, they set on fire. But they have to be damaged first. The point I'm making here is that there is no percentage chance of your fuel tank setting on fire or anything like that. It's just a thing that happens when a certain condition has been met. Now this means that preventative maintenance or an automatic fire extinguisher can't change the percentage chance of you being set on fire to shots to the fuel tanks, because there is no percentage chance. It's just when your fuel tanks have 0 health, you are now on fire. So the automatic fire extinguisher passive doesn't actually do anything to fires caused by damage to your fuel tanks, and that's where the 112 burns from. So there is no point, or you don't get any real benefit from the passive of the automatic fire extinguisher. Now of course it would still go off and put your fire out after only one click, and you wouldn't have to push a button yourself, but they are quite expensive, and personally I just have the fire extinguisher remapped to a key that is easy for me to hit. You still take at least 3 ticks worth of damage with it being a manual fire extinguisher, but that's what I do. And there are still times when you get set on fire twice in this tank. It is really quite a frustrating feature of the machine. Let's go with that. So, I think that's everything I wanted to say in the garage. We'll go and have a look at the module locations, the armour scheme, and of course show you a little bit of gameplay. Alright, we're going to have a quick look at some of the module locations for the 112. Now, frustratingly, the websites I use, they don't show the biggest, most frustrating module location of this tank. This tank has a frontal fuel tank, and that's the most problematic thing about this entire machine. That frontal fuel tank. So that can be annoying. In fact, it is annoying, and it will get you set on fire a lot, but for some reason it's not shown here. Also, frontal driver, sometimes he gets knocked out because this lower plate is quite weak, so shots to the lower plate can also kill your driver. From the side, you've got engine and fuel tanks in the rear, as well as the fuel tanks in the front and behind the lower front plate. You've also, of course, got your crew in the turret. So you've got your commander, gunner and loader all in the turret, and the driver in the hull. From the rear, again, you've got the engine and fuel tanks. You've also got an ammo rack going around the right hand side of the turret here, or right hand side as we look at the turret from the back. And if we go round to the right hand side of the vehicle, you can see that ammo rack loops around the side of the turret. Not sure where the hull ammo rack is. Tanks usually have an ammo rack in the hull and one in the turret, but the turret ammo rack is that white strip that you see there. And from above, there's nothing really to note. Fairly large engine deck for artillery to hit, however. So let's go and have a quick look at the armor profile. So here we go, 112's armor profile. Rear armor is 60 odd millimeters on the hull, which is fairly easy to penetrate. Similar on the back of the turret. It's not HE penetration territory, but for most guns, but it can be penetrated. On the sides, you've got this 80 millimeters of armor, but it's at an angle. You've got tracks adding on to your effective armor. You've got a little bit of spaced armor here, all of which increase your effective side armor. Now, your side armor, this is not an IS-3. You do not have magic Soviet side armor. It's not going to eat shells all day long. But your side armor's not bad, and you can side scrape with it to get some reasonable values out of the tank. However, if you do that, you do need to be very careful, because you can see under here this 80 armor continues to the front, and if you side scrape and you give them a bit too much angle, it's quite easy for people to shoot your inside drive wheel, track you and penetrate your hull. Let me just angle that a little bit more and you'll see what I mean, and that can put you in a whole world of trouble. Now, it's not a shot that every tank is going to be able to make. Lower tier tanks aren't going to be able to do this, but a lot of the opposition you will meet would be able to pull that out, so you do have to be very careful about over angling this tank. Right, the frontal armor. Let's start with the bad news. This lower front plate is 80 millimeters thick, and so in most engagements has an effective thickness of no more than about 110-115 millimeters. You can penetrate this with a lot of tier 6 light tanks. Heck, there are tier 5 light tanks that can penetrate this. And behind this, as already mentioned, is a driver and a fuel tank. So this is horrible. You want to hide this lower plate at all costs. You don't have to go full hull down in this tank, as your upper plate is pretty good, but you want to hide this lower front plate. Now, talking about the upper plate, it's 120 millimeters with a pretty good angle on it. The angle is something like 60 degrees or something. Yeah, armor angle 60 degrees. So just straight on from the front, that gives you effective armor thicknesses of somewhere in the 230 to 240 range, even without any other effort on your part. Now, if you're using all the gun depression this tank has, which if you find yourself in a position where you can do that, that's fantastic. You're looking at something like that, and your upper front plate goes to over 300. So this upper front plate is very tough. I mean, it's basically the same upper plate that you get on the 113, the tier 10 Chinese heavy tank, but it's here at tier 8. So this is a very nice upper front plate to have. The turret. Well, the turret is a mixture of good news and bad news. The good news, it's 240 millimeters thick at the front, which is really nice. And then you've got this gun mantlet on top of it as well in the middle. You can get some really, really thick armor values. The front of the turret is very, very sturdy. The bad news is when we get to the top. See these cupolas? They're 150 millimeters thick, and they're big, and they're easy to shoot, and most tanks that you're facing will be able to shoot these and penetrate them all day long. So if you try to go hull down, or you try to just expose your turret, and I've had this problem, it's quite common for people to shoot you in either one. It's not as if you even have one cupola, you have two of them in either one of these cupolas, and that really does make you quite sad. Also, for 75mm guns, or for guns that are greater than 75mm in caliber, this turret roof is only 25mm thick, so it can completely overmatch your turret roof. So if you can use that gun depression and hide as much of your of the roof of your turret and of those commander's hatches as you can, then do go for it. But bear in mind, with 6 degrees of gun depression, you're going to be more limited on positions that you can use than if you were, say, in a Japanese, British, or American tank with 10 degrees. or even a German tank with their typical 8. So do bear that in mind. These are very frustrating, and in my opinion, this whole area really significantly reduces the usable armor of the 112, because even if you use it perfectly, it's relatively straightforward for people to penetrate you in this area. It's not as if it's even easy to do weak spot management. The cupolas are just too large to do that effectively most of the time, but there we go, that is life, I'm afraid. The one thing I will note before moving on is that of course you get a 122mm gun, which can triple overmatch 40mm of armour, and the turret roof of the Tiger II and the VKA, the German Tier 8 heavy tanks, is 40mm. So you can penetrate them in the turret roof with your regular armour piercing rounds, which is a nice feature, but it's not a feature unique to this tank. So, without further ado, let's jump into some gameplay. Now, as it actually turns out, I'm going to show you well, 2 games as usual here in the Chinese 112. Both of these games are actually going to be Tier 9 affairs, but they should hopefully highlight a few different features of the tank. So, we're kicking off with this game. As I mentioned, it's a Tier 9 game. It's an assault game on Karelia. It is Karelia, right? Yeah, Karelia. Just had that moment of derpitude. And we are on the defending team. Now, although this is a Tier 9 game, it's not a very Tier 9 game. Looking at the enemy team, they've got an M103 and a Tier 9 waffle thrower, plus a pair of KV-4s. I mean, we're looking at tanks that are going to be difficult to penetrate frontally. In fact, actually, the Tiger II and the VKs can also be a pain, depending on how long they give me to aim at their slightly squishier parts. So that can be problematic. If we look at the lower tiers, they're not too much of a problem. Now, here we are. There's a Comet, speaking of one of the lower tiers. Or I say they're not too much of a problem. We can penetrate the Comet, but the Comet can still penetrate us because of that horrendous lower front plate. Now, there's myself and an AMX 5100 up here. Hello, Mr. VK. I'm going for those turret roof shots, and I actually managed to make that one work. And there you can see, aiming for the roof of the turret on the VKA. I mentioned this earlier on. 40mm thick, you triple overmatch it with the 122mm gun on the 112. That is by no means a feature unique to the 112. The same would be true if I were in an IS-6 or an IS-3 or a WZ-111 or whatever. But it definitely is something that you can do in the tank. So, my second shot wasn't quite so lucky, but I've managed to put one into that VK, which isn't too bad. And nightmare scenario, there's the M103. Now, like I said, there's an AMX 5100 here as well. We've also got a KV-4 in the background, and that KV-4 managed to bounce on me, but the Comet, as I've now fired, took aim at me and penetrated me, but I managed to put a shot into him as well, and the AMX 5100 finishes him off. And actually, looking at the scoreline, it's 6-1. This game is actually going pretty well. One shot into the rear of the M103 there, and it looked like it also tracked him into the bargain, which is nice. Don't have huge amounts of fire support. It doesn't look like I have huge amounts of fire support. And these guys are continually bouncing off my upper front plate. So the upper front plate of this tank is pretty good. Take a penetration there. Just a second. Where was I penetrated? There, you can see. So interestingly, I've taken 2 penetrations, or possibly 3 so far, and these 2 have both been in this big, fat commander's cupola on the left-hand side of my tank. If I'd been side-scraping out the other way, it would be in this right-hand side hatch. And then, of course, there is also my lower plate, but I'm trying to hide as much of that as possible with this rock in front. Managed to put that shot. That was a little bit lucky for that top part of the turret on the KV-4. That is 180mm thick if memory serves, so I needed a slightly high damage roll. And I've loaded a heat round for my next shell because I was expecting to have to use the heat round to penetrate the KV-4. As I say, with the AP round, I had to get quite lucky with my penetration rolls. As it is, I managed to make it work, so I now have a heat round to unload at whoever I want, and I'm able to put that straight through the front of the turret of the VKA. Switching back to my armor piercing rounds now. On the one hand, I wouldn't have considered that heat round necessary. On the other hand, it's unlikely that shot would have penetrated the VK without using heat, but it's not the sort of thing I like to switch to in that situation. I'd rather go for the turret roof, but as it is, the KV-4 manages to take out the VK in the end. Anyway, just this M103 left over here, and there's only 3 tanks left on the enemy team now. He flubs his shot, and that was too much of a steep angle on the M103's turret. The M103's turret isn't the strongest turret in the world, but that angle, as I say, was just too steep. AMX 5100 manages to finish him off. There's the Tier 9 waffle thrower and the RU-251 remaining now. I don't think I really get to see much more action. Could be wrong. No, the RU is still alive. Just speed this along a little bit. No, there we go. They're both dead. And that is the game. So, in that game we got to see that, well, you got to see the armour in action, basically. The fact that these commander's hatches really are a bit of an issue. But the upper front plate can be quite bouncy. So there we go. And the gun, while not very good, can do some work if you know where to shoot and if you target the right bits of the enemy tank. And if you're not afraid to switch to a little bit of heat ammunition if necessary. So there we go, that was the first game. So that game was actually enough for first class mastery, fire for effect, shell proof, and spotter ribbons for the 112. 2,397 damage done. 1 kill, 1,187 base experience, because in addition to that damage we also picked up over 2,000 assistance damage. 1,820 damage blocked by our armour. We received 9 hits, of which 3 penetrated. There was one from, I think it was one from the M103, one from a Comet, and I can't remember where the other one came from. 4 enemy vehicles spotted, 4 damaged, 1 killed. In terms of profitability, well, we fired a single heat round there. So our ammunition resupply costs were not small, but even with a standard account we still made a 53,000 credit profit, which isn't too bad. With a premium account that would have been an 88,000 credit profit. So that was quite a profitable game. And the credit coefficient on the 112 does seem to be pretty good. It's just offset by the ammunition resupply costs, which are also quite high, with the tanks reliance, shall we say, on the occasional heat round here or there. Anyway, let's move on to the second game. Here we go then. As mentioned, this is another Tier 9 game. The 112 gets limited matchmaking, which I don't think I mentioned before, so it only sees Tier 9 games at the worst. It does not see Tier 10 games, which is something to be thankful of. But this is a far more Tier 9 game than the previous one was. If we look at the enemy team, in the previous game we just had 2 Tier 9s to worry about. One of which was an M103, which isn't the toughest heavy tank in the world, and the other one was a Tier 9 waffle thrower. This game we've got an ST1, a T10, a T54, Object 704, and that Tier 9 artillery. So it's a rather harder affair, or more difficult affair. But here you can see we have managed to get ourselves up to that maximum speed, and you know, we're basically keeping up now with the faster tanks on our team, the T54 and the Foch. Now you'll notice this drop off immediately if we start going uphill, but in terms of actually you know, trundling along at a reasonable top speed in the right situation, yeah, the 112 is perfectly capable of that, and it would go faster than an IS-6, for example. So remembering that what we want to do with this armour profile is hide our lower front plate at all costs, because otherwise bad things happen. I'm just trying to figure out what exactly it is that I'm going to do in this game. So our WZ-111 1-4 has gone out way too far. He's getting pummeled in the side. He's tracked out there, and it's just a bad time to be him. Take a shot at the T10, get really lucky there. That shot had no right to penetrate, but I thought, he's going to pull back, I'm going to pull back, let's just take the pump. And straight off the bat, we've lost our WZ-111. So that's one of our Tier 9s down. That's a bit of a blow to our team. I mean, the T10 didn't come out of it unscathed or anything, but even so, obviously it would have been nice not to lose our WZ for, well, he achieved quite, he didn't really achieve a lot, let's be honest. We have managed to take out the enemy's T-71, which is something, so yeah, the scorelines are 1-1, but a WZ is more valuable than a T-71 at the end of the day. Now they do have a couple of artillery, of course, we have to be careful of that, and I'm trying to get myself into a position from which I can use the gun depression here to try and hide my lower front plate. And here you can see some of the problems I'm having. In order to shoot these guys, you know, this position doesn't really work for this tank. If I were in a tank with more gun depression, fine, but in order to shoot some of the guys to my left, I'd have to expose far too much of my tank. So instead, I just pre-aim in case the Super Purging or the T-10 or someone wants to pop around the corner. And there we just saw the M53-55 artillery piece just doing insane amount of damage to our T-54 and killing him. Well, there we go. Thankfully our team manages to take out the ISU-152 and the T-10. Now, we've got a T-54 now who's advanced on our T-29. The problem is, if I go around in an effort to try and help that T-29, I open myself up to fire from the T-54, the TVP, and the Super Pershing, who is still snugly around that corner. So that was actually not a particularly good engagement for me. And as it is, I also, it seems, open myself up to fire from the ST-1, who has now come round the corner as his opposition has disappeared. Put that shot, try to put it into what looks like a commander's hatch or driver's hatch or something on the front of the tank, but it doesn't work. Pull back. Someone's hit our Super Purging with a HE round, probably artillery. He's on fire. This is why you bring a fire extinguisher. Going for that lower front plate, and I'm loading a heat round next because no, it didn't penetrate. In fact, by the look of it, it didn't even hit the lower front plate, which is what I was aiming for. It hit the upper front plate, which makes me kind of sad. Take a little bit of damage there from artillery, bounce the round from the ST-1 and manage to put a heat round through his lower front plate. So here is where your heat ammunition really comes to the fore, penetrating relatively flat surfaces. But unfortunately, I take another hit there from the ST-1. And we've got this M4A1 behind us, which is, well, let's say not optimal. ST-1 has now fired, but I'm not confident that I could go up there and put a shot into the ST-1 without taking a return shot myself, and the return shot will of course kill me, as the ST-1 has 440 alpha damage. If I can force the ST-1 to come over the ridge toward me, however, then we can use our heat ammunition to take him out. So switching back to armor piercing now. We've only got 341 health remaining. Scoreline is 9-7. And we know the Object 704 is around here somewhere, so if I was planning on engaging that Object 704, I should probably actually have heat loaded. Very unlikely to penetrate him with armor piercing. But I don't want to engage him because his BL-10 gun can go straight through my armor. And as it is, our artillery nukes him anyway, so it's not necessary. Enemy team are just left with their M53-55, a Super Pershing, Yak Panther, SU-152, and the Crusader self-propelled gun. Coming down this hill, and again you can see we're picking up a good head of speed coming down here. That maximum top speed really helping us out. And we're just going to swing up here, try and engage the bad guys, find out where they are. I am, however, very conscious that in doing something like that, in cresting any sort of ridgeline, you do expose your lower front plate, which is, just to reiterate this point, made of cheese and fuel tanks and drivers, which is not good. So do bear that in mind. KV-3 is pushing forwards. We're going to try and follow that guy up. It's just the two of us pushing along here. And even though they're tier 7 tank destroyers, an ambush from them could still be very, very painful. Yak Panther gets a good 105mm gun, and, well, the SU could be using a 122 or that 152mm howitzer, firing either high explosive or possibly heat ammunition. So we do need to be a little bit wary of him. Found both the tank destroyers. As it is, they're not in a position to engage us. But the enemy artillery does manage to nuke our KV-3, so that's him down, which just leaves me as the one advancing along here. Take a shot at the SU-152 and shave off most of his health. He misses his shot, so I should have the reload. And the enemy self-propelled gun, the Crusader, manages to hit me. and leave me on 64 health. I finish off the Su-152, try to back off, but the Super Pershing finishes me off, and that's my game, unfortunately. He got me in the side, fair enough. I didn't quite know where it was, and it was a decent ambush from him. As it is, the scoreline is 12-9. We've got light tanks all over their artillery. If this AMX 1375 can actually hit his shots, that's half his magazine wasted. He might as well reload it now. And there's the Super Pershing, losing large amounts of health. AMX manages to finish him off. Artillery, shotguns, our T25-2. Really like this AMX to actually aim his shots. T30 nails the artillery. And voila, that ends up being the game. So let's go and have a look at those post-battle results. So this game ended up being enough for second class mastery, sharpshooter, and fire for effect. Came second on our team in terms of XP earned, 2,092 damage done, so not as much as last time. 2 kills, and commiserations, by the way, to the enemy M53-55, almost 6,000 damage done in that artillery piece, which is a good result, but not enough to bring his team over the winning line. 9 shots fired, 9 hits, 7 penetrations for that damage count. Received 7 hits, of which 5 penetrated, 2 did not. 2 hits a result of splash damage, so we damaged 400, well, 2 lots of 440 basically from that ST1, so we blocked 880 damage with our armour. Got a little bit of assistance damage, and here you can see our ammunition resupply costs, because we fired 3 heat rounds to deal with that ST1, were rather higher, almost 23,000 credits, so our profit was rather lower. This, a bit like the Super Pershing, is one of those tanks that relies on the occasional use of premium ammo, and the occasional use of premium ammo, of course, eats into your credit margin. But I wanted to show this game partly for that reason, but also because you got to see the tank use its full speed. You got to see it use its 45 kilometers an hour top speed, and that is definitely a pro for the machine. Now, I do actually have one more very short bit of gameplay I wanted to show you. I know it's unusual, but this is not a full game. I just wanted to, well, as I say, I just wanted to show you. You'll see why in a second. Right, here we go. As I said, this is not going to take particularly long. Now, spoiler alert, I spent quite a bit of time throughout this video talking about how naff the lower front plate is, and how it sucks when you get shot in there and set on fire. But the 2 games I showed you didn't actually showcase me getting set on fire. There's a very good reason for that, because generally speaking, if you do get set on fire, you tend to have quite a short, frustrating, uneventful game. Speaking of which, this is the 112. We're top tier now. It's a tier 8 game. We're here on Overlord. And, well, yeah, you'll see. I'm technically in a platoon, but this is one of those platoons you create at the time. I believe the GW Panther and the Gorilla were already in a platoon, which explains how a tier 5 made it into this game, and then they invited me and I accepted, or maybe that's just a replay bug. Occasionally it does bug out when showing platoons. I don't know, it's not really relevant. So, coming over to this little ravine here, because I want to try and keep the engagement fairly linear. The 112 does not like being flanked at all. Its side armour can't really hold up to it, and because its armour only works in given situations, the tank in general is quite, it punishes you a lot for not being in the optimal position, put it that way. So, initially, I was just thinking I can use this gentle incline to try and hide my lower front plate and do some damage. There's a T-44, we put 384 into him. Jolly good, he misses his shot, and I'm just coming back for the re-engage. There are 3 artillery on the enemy team that we do need to be a bit wary of. There we go, managed to put a second shot into that T-44. Given the range, it's kind of a little bit fortunate for me to hit and penetrate both of those shots. Su-122-44 up there. Don't want to go too far forwards in case I expose my lower front plate and then things go wrong. But there's another Su-122-44, surprise IS-3 from the side. He hits my tank in the side, damages the fuel tank, sets the tank on fire. I use my fire extinguisher, then I get hit by artillery, which damages my fuel tanks again, setting my tank on fire again, which takes out the driver, the ammo rack, and suddenly I'm on 153 health. And the IS-3 just takes aim and puts a shot through my lower front plate to end my little adventure. So I wanted to show you that game just to give you an idea of what happens in the 112 when it all goes wrong. So we took our first shot in the side from the IS-3, which set, if you remember, the fuel tanks are in the rear of the tank and extend up to the side of the tank. So that's the IS-3 does enough damage with its gun to destroy my fuel tanks in one shot, thereby setting me on fire. We used the fire extinguisher to put that fire out. We then got hit by a tier 6 artillery piece that set me on fire again by damaging my fuel tanks again. And, you know, we only had one fire extinguisher, so we kept burning. That burning killed our driver, or was it our gunner? No, it was our driver, I believe, and took out our ammo rack, and by the time it had eventually finished burning, we were left on about 130 health, and the IS-3 was able to just poke round a corner, aim at our lower front plate, and penetrate us without too much effort. So yeah, that is the sort of thing that can happen when you're driving the 112. You should get used to it. And experiences like this can be really frustrating. I thought it was important with this tank to show you a NAF game because it is quite an inconsistent performer. Anyway, after all that, let's just jump back into the garage and round things out. So, what do I think of this machine overall? I think it's pretty darn terrible. Now, the 112 does have its fans. I know it does. But the general consensus, and it's an opinion that I agree with, seems to be that it's just a bad tank. It's just, you compare it to the other tier 8 premiums available and it doesn't stack up. Now when you could purchase this, so before patch 9.15, when you could purchase this tank, it was the most expensive tier 8 premium machine. Oh dear. You know, and so you have to ask someone, would you spend that considerable amount of money for the 112? And the answer I come back with every time is no. No, I would not. I wouldn't, well, obviously I did, but I wouldn't recommend that people do it. The 112 is not a machine I recommend that anyone really get. If you ever do get the chance to get one, yeah, sure, it's possible that you might enjoy it, but the majority of people I've spoken to who've played it don't seem to like the tank. And so I would say it's more likely that you are not going to like it compared, you know, rather than you are going to like it. And if you have to fork out any money for the tank, well, that's a bit of a grim prospect for you to have to face up to. So I cannot recommend the machine. I know there are people, as I say, who like it. I know Quickie Baby likes it, but nah, it's not for me. I mean, I have played games in it, obviously, and I will continue to play some games in it now and then, I imagine, but it's not a tank that I'm going to play a lot anymore. I've got the Ace Tanker in it. I've now done material for a review. That's kind of my bare minimum requirements for the tank completed. So, yeah, I'm not about to recommend you guys buy it, and I'm not about to play huge numbers of games in the machine. So there we go. It's not particularly great. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that review, possibly even found it vaguely informative. If you did, by all means, feel free to catch some of my other videos and or subscribe to my channel. And I wish you very happy hunting on that battlefield. Ciao, ciao.